Welcome, everyone. This is episode number 6 of the Broom Closet Briefing podcast. And today we are going to talk a little bit about everything that is going on in the world. I know there's a lot going on. I did not upload a podcast episode in the last 2 weeks because I was out of town and also kind of got sick and kind of wanted my voice to kind of recover so that I can upload this and like talk about this and not like cough in the mic, So let's talk about the war that's going on, the economy, and all the illusion of control, etc. So we are going to talk a little bit on when is last time this happened before, the astrological insights on that, and what we can expect from a similar kind of pattern, and then I'm also going to talk about the few articles that I have written on this topic in the last 2 weeks and kind of like uh like connect the dots for you as well. So I'm going to link those articles in the show notes. So if you haven't read them, you will be able to like know which one I'm talking about and kind of like go read them. All right, so let's grab a cup of tea or water or whatever beverage it's going to be a little bit that you will be listening to this episode. So, all right, let's get started. So, I wanted to take a step back and look at the last few weeks, like not really as isolated headlines, but more like a sequence. So, you will start to notice that something that is a little bit unsettling and also kind of strangely kind of makes sense. What would appear at first glance to be a clusterfuck of like unrelated developments begins to kind of organize itself into a pattern that is almost difficult to ignore, like for me at least. So, the escalation that is involving Iran, the persistent anxiety around the economy, and also the theatrical resurfacing of like, we are going to go after Cuba, right? All these geopolitical talking points, they do not really sit in separate containers anymore. They begin to kind of feel like different expressions of the same underlying condition. And what makes this even more striking is that this pattern did not emerge all of a sudden. It was already kind of there, kind of visible, forming. And in the three pieces that I am going to refer to and I wrote in the last 2 weeks leading up to this moment. So, the economic reading that I did on the next 6 months, remember it was just for the next 6 months, it did not predict a dramatic collapse. So, we are probably not going to see that in 2026, which is what most people would instinctively look for. Like instead, it kind of described something far more subtle and important, like a system that is still functioning on the surface, but it is beginning to show signs of depletion underneath. So, the image that I anchored in that reading was not really destruction, but exhaustion, right? Remember the first card? So, and that distinction matters because economies rarely they break when people kind of panic. They begin to slow when people like disengage, right? So that shift is almost kind of invisible at first, but it doesn't show up as a headline. It doesn't really kind of announce itself with a sudden drop. It almost reveals itself as a behavior. So consumers, for example, who were once like driving momentum will begin to like hesitate with their purchasing power. So spending will become more and more deliberate, more cautious and selective, and the question that quietly would change from what do I want and what do I actually need. And once that psychological pivot would happen at scale, the trajectory of the economy would begin to change, even if the data has not caught up yet. And this is the phase where everything will still appear stable to some extent, but will market may also even point to like we have made this growth and that growth, a little bit spike here, a little bit spike there, and headlines will still kind of like celebrate performances, maybe a little bit of job growth or whatever, but the underlying energy will sustain that performance has already kind of begun to weaken underneath. So at the same time, that same reading also pointed to something else that was easy to overlook if you are only watching the surface narrative, right? The public facing story would continue to emphasize the resilience aspect and the prosperity, and there is a parallel process that is unfolding among institutions and those who operate closest to the mechanics of the system. So there is a quiet preparation taking place right there. Like people are beginning to move the assets, they're repositioning them, risk are being recalibrated, right? So decisions are being made not in response to like already visible crisis, but in an anticipatory one, right? So this is not necessarily a panic behavior, don't get me wrong, but it is like a strategic adjustment because people are already making that calculation that, say, for example, the dollar value can actually go down, or the like the value of the American currency. And it will tend to happen before the whole system kind of recognizes from where it's coming. So, when you place that economic backdrop next to the second piece that I'm going to talk about, which is the US Iran war, the relationship between the internal pressure and the external action will become much, much clearer. So that reading that I did on the US Iran war did not describe one single event, but more like a progression in how power expresses itself under strain. So it begins with like more like a projection with the assertion of authority and control, right? And it is followed almost immediately by a shifting narrative of landscape where the justification of that action will evolve depending on what is required in that moment. The stated reasons move sometimes with subtly, things will like be like, oh, we did it for this reason and that reason. Sometimes it may even move dramatically and the story will adapt in real time. What emerges from that sequence is not a picture of like a clean confidence strategy. We already know about that by now. They don't have a strategy, but more like a system that is managing multiple layers of uncertainty while attempting to maintain the appearance of the coherence that we see. So the war operates on two levels, right? Now, one is the visible layer where messaging, speeches, and official positions are presented to the public, and there is this less visible layer, the second layer, where decisions are made in far more complex and opaque environment. Over time, this gap between the two layers will widen, and the narrative will become less and less coherent, and and it will be less about clarity and more about like the control. So the final phase of that progression is particularly telling because it reveals something about how these situations kind of tend to resolve rather than a definitive conclusion. What often emerges is an exit, like that is framed as success. We've seen that in 2003 in the Iraq War. And regardless of the underlying reality, there will be like, oh, we just won this situation. So the emphasis will shift from outcome to just the optics of the presentation, and from resolution to just the interpretation aspect of it. So that does not indicate any strength in the traditional sense, and it indicates like a need to preserve the perception of the strength rather, even when the situation itself is far more like ambiguous. The third piece that I wrote was focusing on Cuba. That adds another dimension to this pattern, and it is perhaps the most psychologically revealing one of the three. Cuba does not reappear as the logical next step in a forward moving geopolitical strategy, right? We're already in a war with some other country in the Middle East. Why would we want another conflict again, which is right, in the backyard of United States, because it reappears as something closer to a symbolic fixation, right? A remnant of an earlier era that continues to occupy the space in the political imagination. So again, no strategy, right? There's absolutely no strategy. And the fact that it surfaces at all in this moment, it suggests that the system is not entirely oriented towards the future. Instead, it is reaching back towards like familiar narratives, familiar tensions, and unresolved historical threads. So, this tendency to revisit older scripts is rarely a sign of confidence. That's all I want to make a point. It usually indicates that the system is operating under a level of strain that basically limits its ability to generate entirely new approaches. So the repetition kind of becomes like a fallback, and the past is easier to navigate than an uncertain future, even if returning to it does not actually resolve the present problem. In that sense, Cuba would function less as a concrete objective and more as a reflection of how the system is thinking under pressure. I hope that makes sense. When these three strands are brought together, because these are, again, I said, not in isolated container, they might look like one. But basically, this is all talking about the economic exhaustion, the geopolitical escalation, the reactivation of historical narratives, right? Individually. And they begin to reinforce each other in a way that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. So the common thread that is running through all of them is not collapse, at least not in the immediate sense. It is more like a pressure point. It is a sense that the system is being tested in multiple areas at once, and that its responses are kind of becoming more and more reactive and performative and less grounded in the long term stability. So, this is where the broader astrological context becomes really relevant and not an abstract overlay, but as a framework that describes the type of stress being applied. So I mentioned that soon we are going to see Chiron moving into Taurus in the mid 2026, and then we have Saturn moving into Taurus again sometimes later this week. So Taurus, which basically governs the material foundation of life, which includes resources, money, energy, food, and the structures that create a sense of stability. So when Chiron, which is the wound which moves through this space, it exposes those vulnerabilities in these areas. So it will bring attention to where security is, for example, fragile, where systems are overextended, and where the perception of stability may not fully align with reality. So when Saturn engages with the same territory, the dynamic shifts from exposure, like it shifts basically from exposure to enforcement. So the question is no longer where the weakness kind of exists, but whether or not the system can actually withstand it. So this is not a theoretical process, right? It plays out in tangible ways through economic cycles, resource constraints, and structural adjustments that cannot be avoided indefinitely. So the late 1970s is what the period I would actually draw the parallels to. Again, like the coincidence, it's not coincidence because it is basically the same blueprint as we were having this similar conflict going on in the same country called Iran during that time, that between 1970s to 1980s offer a clear historical parallel as well as astrological parallel, where similar pressures forced a recalibration of how energy and economic systems functioned. That period did not result in the collapse of the American economy, not immediate collapse. It was what we called was a stagflation, but it did initiate a transformation that reshaped the trajectory of growth for many, many decades to come in the future. So in the present moment, the same type of pressure appears to be building. Although the scale and the complexity of the modern system make the outcome less predictable. So, the tension around energy, amplified by this geopolitical conflict, that would feed directly into the economic uncertainty. Uh, while that uncertainty in turn would influence the behavior at both the institutional and the individual level. So, as the behavior would shift, the system would adjust, right? And those adjustments would create new conditions that further would influence geopolitical decisions. So, it kind of becomes like a feedback loop where each component would reinforce the other. And within that loop, the role of the political structure will become increasingly complex, and they are tasked not only with managing tangible outcomes but also with maintaining a narrative of stability. As pressure would increase, the gap between those two responsibilities can absolutely widen, and the emphasis on presentation can become more and more pronounced. Actions will be framed, explained, justified in ways that prioritize the coherence, even when the underlying situation is far more fluid and flexible. So, this does not indicate an immediate breaking point, but it does suggest the system is actually moving into a phase where maintaining equilibrium will require more and more effort, more intervention, and more careful management than before. The absence of a dramatic collapse should not be mistaken for the absence of change. I'm going to give you that. What is unfolding is way slower and more gradual, and in many ways more consequential because of that. So, over the next several months, the most likely trajectory is not a sudden disruption, but more like a continuation of this pattern. The economy will remain outwardly stable, while underlying behavior will continue to shift. So, geopolitical tension would persist, not necessarily escalating into a single, like outcome, but contributing to a sustained atmosphere of uncertainty. Institution will still continue to prepare quietly, adjusting to conditions that have not yet fully materialized in public discourse. So, what makes this moment significant is not any single event, but the convergence of multiple pressures that are all pointing in the same direction. The system is not collapsing, but it is being tested in ways that will shape what comes next. And those tests are already underway, whether they are acknowledged openly or not. So, in that sense, the question is not whether change is coming, but how it will unfold and what it will require. Because once a system kind of enters this kind of a phase, it does not simply return to what it was before. I think it will never return to what it was before. It will adapt, restructure, and in doing so, it will become something entirely different. So why did I say that this period was very similar to the 1970s? Like the current wave of anxiety around this energy crisis and the supply chain that will happen that I already talked about reminds means during this period of stagflation, the Carter presidency, and when the United States was kind of forced to confront the reality that cheap energy and stable global supply were not guaranteed forever, right? This was the same transit that I talked about, Chiron moving into Taurus, that tends to expose the vulnerabilities around resources, money, food, and energy. So we are going to be seeing the similar themes. We will be approaching a very similar symbolic weather pattern again. When Chiron and Saturn will activate Taurus in the US chart in the coming years, the resonance will be similar to the 1977 to 1984 era. That earlier period did not collapse the American economy, right? Instead, it kind of forced the American economy up. With a painful recalibration of how energy industry and inflation was managed. Out of the turbulence came efficiency standards, right? The acceleration of computing and microelectronics, and the technological backbone that would define the next 40 years of economic growth. So, crises around this energy, which is similar again, have a peculiar historical habit of forcing societies to innovate their way into the future. So I think this is actually eventually gonna work out in United States favor. The part we will be going through will be painful, where we have to adjust when resources suddenly will become more expensive or unstable. The economic system will reorganize around efficiency, resilience, and new technology. So the stagflation era during the Carter presidency quietly pushed the world towards microelectronics, automation, and smarter industrial systems, right? A similar dynamic can actually unfold again. And here is my hypothesis. This time, the transformation may be a way more dramatic. The pressure of rising energy costs and this geopolitical instability, which kind of dictates this energy crisis at this point, may accelerate the global transition towards the renewable infrastructure, which includes solar, wind, storage, and intelligent electric grids, which will potentially be moving advanced economies towards a future where as much as 80 to 90% of energy generation would come from green or renewable resources. In that sense, this Taurus lesson is rarely the destruction. It is about repricing reality, and when the cost of old systems kind of becomes unbearable, the world would build new ones, and the technologies that emerge often define the next economic era. And I do think that US has always been like has always ushered the leadership in some way or the other, be it in the geopolitical spectrum, like making peace, or at least on paper, or like leading economies through depression, or like a hard economic era. It has always shown the world what comes next, and then the rest of the world can actually did follow through. When we talk about this is a 250 years of empire crumbling, and US is probably this empire which is going to crumble, which may mean something else. It can totally mean that the old world order of how a capitalistic society functioned with, for example, this energy crisis, is very well be the dictator, right? The dictator of this capitalism that has been our issue, and how it functioned. Maybe that is what is crumbling. That is how I look at it. That it is, if this period parallel is true, then US might be leading in the future, at least when we are done with this period, the clean energy leadership, when the rest of the world actually does follow through. So I am actually I'm looking at it as with a very um, what should I say, like optimistic lens. And I think that um, once we are done with this, we are going towards something that is way more sustainable. And I think United States will still be a leader in that way, because we'll be forced to innovate ourselves first, and then we show the world that this can totally be done. So I hope this gives you a little bit of hope that not everything is all like destroyed. And if things are getting destroyed, it's because there is a reason for it, because there is a better world that exists, and we are going towards that. So this whole episode's point was to give you that glimpse of the future that is totally what is probably coming, uh, based on the astrological blueprint as well. All right. I hope this was kind of insightful. I mean, if it was, then please leave me a comment or some review on your favorite podcast player that you listen to it. If you haven't subscribed to my Substack, please do, because this is a time where independent creators like me are making a difference. I think if it's like, if you think that my publication and my work helps you, uh, you know uh, with your day-to-day life, and gives you hope for a better future, then please do subscribe and support my work, because it is completely reader supported. And I also have a private Patreon where I teach my method of how to read tarot for political world events and for doing predictive readings. Check out my Patreon, which is going to be linked to this episode as well. And I will see you guys in the next podcast episode. Until then, make sure don't get sucked into doomerism. Don't be a doomer, be a broomer. Okay? All right. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. And until then, take very good care of yourself and have a very good rest of the week.